Okay, I think we'll get started. Happy Thursday to everybody. It's the end of May. Hope you all are safe and healthy and doing well as we conclude this part of the spring. And this is our final Canvas meeting for the spring 2020 period. My name is Brett Knackman. Many of you know me as the person who sends you the emails as it pertains to Canvas, our College Autism Network Virtual Association of Scholars. I know many of you have been to our meetings before, but for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, a friendly reminder to please have your microphones muted if you are not speaking. As I had said earlier, we want to try to eliminate any background noise that might be distracting to folks. You're welcome to use your video function if you'd like. There is a chat box function, so you can insert your questions and thoughts throughout today's presentation. We welcome your contribution, so feel free to participate in any manner that you would like. There is also a link to the meeting agenda in the chat box, so please indicate that you are in attendance at our meeting. That way we'll have that illustrated in our meeting minutes. You also notice that if technology cooperates, we will have this video recorded for future access. We had that for a couple of meetings prior in the spring semester as well. So in our meeting update following today's meeting, you'll be provided with links to both the meeting minutes and the video recording, as well as Ryan's presentation. That way folks can check that out at their leisure. There is also a link to the article that Ryan will be talking about in the chat box, as well as in the meeting agenda. So if you'd like to access that as he is speaking, you're welcome to do so, or to read it at a later point. So just a few other logistics. We'll be going through a few updates at the beginning. Ryan's presentation will encompass the majority of the time today, and we'll have time toward the end for Q&A. So I'll provide an introduction to Ryan in just a few minutes. But yeah, we're glad to have everybody on board for today. A few Canvas-related items that I'll mention, and I'll encourage my colleagues Lee and Brad to jump in if they would like. A few things is that, as always, you are welcome to connect with us at any point, share resources. Many of you are conducting research studies or are disseminating articles, and we use our Canvas listserv toward that end. A link for that is in the meeting agenda. I believe most of you joining us today are on the listserv already, but if not, that's definitely a great platform for sharing resources. And that's also how you hear about updates from all of us at College Autism Network as it pertains to Canvas. So we encourage you to be part of that. Also too, you can share resources. There's the can-canvas at collegeautismnetwork.org email. That's where you can send resources. And we also want to let you know that we continue to get a lot of good insights and updates as it pertains to the very iterative nature of college-based autism programs that exist around the country. And so we are continuing to make some updates on that front, and you should expect an updated version of that to debut shortly to reflect some changes that have unfolded since our last edition back in January, I believe. So those were a few things that are going on with all of us at Canvas, but I want to see if Lee and or Brad have anything they would like to add to that.
Hey, this is Brad. Can you all hear me? I know that you all are desperate to see me as well, so hi, that's me. So a couple of different things, and Brett, I think we'll save on the articles for just a moment here, right? Then the big thing I want to talk to you all about is that just yesterday, We launched a survey that should have gone out to all the directors that we could find on that database of schools that have programs that Brett was talking about earlier. So if you are involved with one of those autism-specific college support programs, either you or someone in your office probably should have received an email from me yesterday or this morning. And if that's not the case, check with your director of the disability services alike. And feel free to reach out to me. It's effectively just trying to get a sense of what's happening in each of these programs for research purposes, but just as importantly for a public database where students can go and find a program that works best for them. And I think that's all I have at this particular moment.
Thanks, Brad.
Lee, anything from you related to Canvas stuff that you want to make sure you share?
Hi, sorry I joined late. I heard you talking about our program director's calls, so thanks for that, Brad.
I didn't actually. You go ahead and mention that. I talked about the survey stuff, so you go ahead and talk about the program director call.
Okay. We've been holding calls with program directors every 3 or 4 weeks, just to talk about strategies, things that are working, technology, hacks, and those invitations have gone out to the program directors listed in the Institutional Initiatives PDF, but they're open to anybody. So if you want to get in on those calls, which last about an hour and are full of good information, just send me an email and I'll add you to the invite list. And we'll have a CAN newsletter out next week with some other updates, and hopefully you're on our mailing list, and so we will be able to share more information with you via the newsletter. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Thanks, Brad. So yeah, definitely a bunch of things going on our front. And also as part of the very robust working group, which is called the Canvas Cross-Institutional Collaborations Working Group. So I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues to share some updates on that front.
Hi, everyone. So we don't have a lot of updates. Can everyone hear me? Cool. I'm using headphones for the first time. We're wrapping up a participatory faculty training, which a lot of you know about, that highlights the stories of autistic college students and faculty, and universal design as a strategy to better support all students, and also touches on online learning for obvious reasons. And we're wrapping that up this week and early next week. So collaborators are editing and adding videos, hopefully by 6/1. And then TC and I, TC Weissman, who co-founded the Autistic Researchers Committee at INSAR, who I think is also on this call and is leading the project with my support, are going to go through and do edits of all of the assessments and the training and then submit the IRB, because our goal is to start running the study a few weeks before the fall term starts. And TC, if you're on the call, did you want to say anything else?
No, I think you nailed it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Yeah, a lot of different exciting things on that front, and it's really cool to see the trainings and the different materials continue to become much more robust as time persists. And I know that many of the folks in our Canvas community have been part of that process, so very, very good indeed. One thing we've been encouraging folks to do both informally and formally via our Canvas community is to share articles. Many of us are attuned to a wide variety of different platforms, whether it be some of us who are researchers and familiar with some of the new scholarship emerging, but also many of you who are practitioners and educators and those who are running these college-based autism programs and are familiar with different news articles that emerge or even resources that you feel that your peers could benefit from. So we've been trying to allocate space for that both informally via the Canvas listserv and then more recently through our Canvas meetings. Often our chat function serves as a really good hub in which we catalog many of those resources, so feel free to do so if there's a relevant point that emerges. But we also want to have intentional time in our meetings toward this end to try to make it a bit more interactive. And certainly we understand if folks don't always want to communicate their thoughts via audio or video, so hence the chat serves that role. But we do have a few articles that we wanted to share, and whether or not you listed it in the meeting agenda, feel free to during this little period. One thing I wanted to point all of your attention to, as you'll see in the meeting agenda, and I'll put a link to it in our chat box in case you do not have access to the agenda at this moment, is an Inside Higher Ed article that debuted recently. It focuses on the role of how neurodiverse students are making sense of COVID-19 and social distancing, and most notably the remote learning component. So if you check out the article, you'll see that there's a few quotes from Solveig Schmolsky, who some of you may recall as being a Canvas presenter last year. She's at Landmark College and talking about how she's been working with students, meeting with them remotely to talk through how they're making sense of this new reality in terms of different skill sets and priorities that they need to address in their daily lives. You'll see some content in regards to how students are both thriving in having this flexibility, but also really seeking that structure when they no longer have a physical campus as the place for studying and taking classes. So it's a quick article. It's very straightforward and definitely worth checking out and thinking about neurodiversity more broadly. So there are some points about not just autism, but also ADHD. One student participant talked about having fibromyalgia as well, and some other experiences and identities. So quick read that might be worth checking out. And I know there's another article listed in this portion, so whoever listed that is welcome to talk about that.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not real good with following instructions, so I forgot to put my own name down there. But it's Brad again. Oh, there's another one from Eric coming up. So Eric, I just saw you post your link up there. Do you want to go ahead and speak real quick about that article?
I don't really have anything to say about it. Just thought it just caught my eye, so just wanted to share that.
Cool. Okay, so then the article that I'm going to post here, there's the link. Oh gosh, I'm really terrible with names. Even you know, John Smith can be tough for me on occasion. So I'm going to get this wrong, but Dikhuis, it's a Dutch author. This study is the reason it caught my eye is that it is trying to hone in on some of the specific kind of autism-specific characteristics, autism-related characteristics, and which of those characteristics, rather than a diagnosis per se, might be affecting college student outcomes. And so this looked at 54, 56, 50-something Dutch students over the first year, I believe, and they had a maximum number of credits that they could earn, and this essentially regressed against how many credit hours they did earn, so predicting how many credit hours they actually did earn, based on a variety of criteria, but included among them was executive functioning, 2 measures of executive functioning, a kind of standardized assessment, and one of them was actually a self-report. And the short version of what they found is that the executive functioning was contributed an awful lot to predicting the outcomes in terms of credits received. And that intuitively makes sense if students are struggling to organize, to plan, to do those types of activities. Yeah, I can see how that would contribute to difficulty earning credit. So anyway, I bring that up because it was one of the first that I've seen that really breaks down which of the autism-related characteristics is driving some of the outcomes.
All right, thank you very much, Brad. Let me open this up. Are there any other articles or resources folks would like to share at this time?
John just dropped in a ton of interesting stuff if you haven't taken a look at the chat for a moment.
John, thank you for that. Are there any points that you'd like to share about those particular pieces?
No, and some of them, well, I shared all of these with the autism group that I run at Purdue Fort Wayne. And some of they're not particularly, let's say, scholarly, but they're more from the layman perspective or maybe a self-advocate perspective. But there are some that are very interesting. A lot of them deal with kind of the teleworld that we're in and the unique challenges that students on the spectrum might face that you might not think about, like the concept of time and routine. When that's thrown out the window, what that does to folks on the spectrum. You know, there was one in there about how the pandemic is making it harder for the person to eat because having that structured schedule, okay, now is when I do this, and I go here, and when all of that is gone, it makes it a great deal more challenging. It's just some kind of interesting, you know, interesting, quick articles for the layman.
Great, thank you, John. And just for folks to feel assured, if you don't have all the links to these articles, we will be cataloging them for dissemination in the meeting minutes, so you can check it out conveniently. You don't have to feel like you have to open up all the links at this time, so we'll catalog that. Thanks, John. If there are other articles that folks would like to drop into the chat during our meeting, feel free to, and we can definitely include them as well. We're going to turn it over now to our featured presentation. I'm really glad to be bringing on Dr. Ryan A. Miller, who's an assistant professor at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Selfishly, I'm really glad because Ryan has been a good friend and mentor of mine for a while. We've collaborated and co-authored an article that he'll be talking about today. It's a really meaningful project. And more than that, he's just a really interesting person who has a lot of great insights to share as a scholar practitioner, someone who's been embedded in both of these spaces and is very familiar with a lot of the experiences that mark students with different types of disabilities. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to leave comments and or questions for him. We'll be allocating at least the last 15 minutes of the meeting toward Q&A, so we'll try to get to that at the 45-minute mark after the hour. All right, Ryan, over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Brett. Hopefully everyone can see me and hear me. And I have also started sharing my screen with a very colorful title slide to start out with. So hopefully everyone can see that. Before I get started, I want to thank you, Brett, for inviting me for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's very good to be with you all right now. And I'm excited about sharing some of this work that Brett has been a co-author and colleague on. I have to say that you all probably know that Brett is a great scholar and researcher and writer. And I have to say, in addition, he is also much better at graphic design and slide design than I am. And I mention that because I have adapted slides that he originally designed from a presentation we gave. And so I can't take credit for the design of that. I truly have to thank Brett for that. My computer, I have to give two caveats before I start. I probably can't look at the chat window while I am presenting, but I am, as Brett alluded to, looking forward to some conversation and Q&A at the end. The other thing, I've had some tech difficulties this week with my computer randomly freezing. Since work at home started, I've had one computer die. Now I'm on the backup, and it seems to be okay, but it overheats sometimes. So I think it'll go fine. When I taught my synchronous class on Tuesday evening, it went just fine sharing my screen. So hopefully that will continue here. So I'm excited to talk about this project with you and the work that Brett and I, along with our colleague Richmond Wynn, who's at the University of North Florida. He's a faculty member in mental health counseling and also now director of the Counseling Center at North Florida. So we all work together on this project around autistic LGBTQ college students, and excited to share some of this with you today. So I also found it important to, tell you just briefly a little bit of background about myself and my work. So I am, as Brett mentioned, at UNC-Charlotte. My PhD in higher education is from UT Austin, and I also earned a portfolio in disability studies at UT. My experience before becoming a faculty member was working in student affairs. And that was one of my positions in student affairs was directing the LGBT Resource Center at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. And I mention that in part because that experience really inspired me to begin a line of research about LGBTQ students with disabilities. And so I definitely go back to that experience of working with students with a variety of intersecting identities, and what that meant, and really in my own learning what I was prepared to do and what I was not prepared to do, and what I thought turning to research and turning to grad school classes that I felt like I should have had more preparation on, and I've been learning ever since and still am. My overall research agenda is really about creating inclusive campus cultures in higher education, and I have sort of two strands of that. One focuses on the experiences of primarily students with minoritized social identities. A centerpiece of that agenda has really been work around LGBTQ students with a variety of disabilities. And then I also look increasingly, I'm looking at how diversity and equity initiatives are institutionalized within higher education. So looking at required diversity courses. I've also done some work around bias response teams as well. My positionality is very important to acknowledge as well. I'm a white, queer, cis man. I was a first generation college student, and I think that really informs sort of the how and why I got into higher ed, and that I feel like I take nothing for granted in higher ed, and I think it's important to identify and unpack assumptions about how we enter higher ed, how we learn, how we teach. I'm also, I do not have a disability presently. I'm neurotypical in most ways, and that was something for the purposes of this study and interviewing participants that I thought a lot about, and initially was unsure whether participants would feel comfortable with me and whether we could build a rapport. What I found with a lot of participants was identifying as queer, identifying as part of the LGBT community was often sort of an entry point for rapport. And despite the fact that I didn't have a disability, in this case was not autistic, participants still really opened up and shared a lot. And I think because there wasn't an assumed shared experience, I actually think participants in many ways shared more detailed information and stories than perhaps they would otherwise if there was sort of an assumed connection of identity there. So there's a lot of text on this screen. I apologize. I wanted to mention that, again, that LGBT students with disabilities, this work has been a large part of my research agenda. And I've been fortunate over now the last 6 or 7 years to produce several publications, book chapters and articles around these topics, and various additional follow-up studies and sort of offshoots from the studies using different data sets. So if any of this piques your interest today, feel free to check out some of the other work and collaborations I've been a part of. And I've linked to my faculty site that has my CV, and then you're also welcome to contact me by email at any point as well. So getting into what we all came here for today, this particular study and article that is now out as of just, I think, less than a month ago in the College Student Affairs Journal. Brett and I, as we looked at existing research, I think it really comes down to around autistic LGBTQ college students, sort of this notion of siloed or silenced. So siloed in the sense of, we certainly do have more research now than we used to around autistic college students and around LGBT students, but not a lot at that particular intersection. And so that has created a lot of invisibility and a lot of silence around this topic. And so we're trying to bring some of these issues and some of these identities together. At the same time, we know that that there is a substantial population that identifies as LGBT and is autistic. And that's something that we see, and in particular, I'm going to get into what some of the study participants talked about in terms of their online engagement of looking at YouTube videos and blogs and reading narratives. So it's becoming prominent in some ways, but still not as much in our research literature. So So we wanted to look at how autistic LGBTQ college students made meaning of their multiple identities and how they manage and express those identities. And so we really take more of a constructivist approach, wanting to understand how students saw themselves, saw their engagement in higher education. And so we did not, it was less about diagnosis, less about a medical approach, less about a biological approach, which some of the previous research in this area, sort of quantifies the population and documents its existence. And so we were taking a bit of a different approach, looking more at identity. So I'll share just a little bit about the study's methods. So this particular piece is actually part of a secondary analysis. So there was a larger study that was originally conducted on 2 campuses, 2 predominantly white universities in the southern United States. And so this was a constructivist grounded theory study of 31 LGBTQ students with disabilities. And so I was really excited for this particular piece that we were able to focus on that there were 8 of the 31 participants were autistic. And so we were able to focus on them in this particular study. So data collection was done through semi-structured interviews, 1 to 2 interviews with each participant about their experiences at college, their identities, how they made meaning of their multiple identities and identity intersections as well. Despite the study, we started out with a grounded theory approach, and that's how we went into analysis initially for this particular study. But as we did things like coding and starting to develop themes, Brett and I really felt strongly that we lost nuance and we lost some of the context if we were to present certain codes and certain themes. And that led us to explore and to eventually adopt in the article that you see a narrative approach, narrative inquiry. And so we felt like with 8 participants that was a manageable enough number to be able to present, even though it really is the tip of the iceberg, but to present some examples from participants' narratives. And so we shifted, rather than sort of chopping up the transcripts into artificial segments, we really shifted into viewing each transcript as a narrative, as a collection of narratives. And I will say that having conducted the majority of the interviews for this study, that students often did not, we would ask a question, an open-ended question, and students would respond often with stories and would go into detail and would elaborate. So we felt that the data we had collected and the approach we wanted to use lent itself well to shifting a bit to a narrative approach. We shared transcripts with participants. I will say that there have been, with participants, we wanted to the extent we could, share some power and decision-making, and also view it not just as a researcher-participant relationship, but see how it could be mutually beneficial. And so there have been, I have maintained some ongoing relationships and collaborations with some of the participants from the study. I've had the opportunity a time or two to present for disability service practitioners, and alongside some of the participants in this research, I've had the opportunity to mentor folks and help review resumes or just sit and chat. So that has been really really meaningful to me and hopefully to the participants as well. I will mention so in grounded theory, typically you don't start with a strong theoretical framework. You want to be really inductive. In the course of analysis, as we were looking at the transcripts from the 8 participants, this framework that we were already familiar with, we started to think that it could be a useful tool theoretically. And so I won't go into all of the details of this, but I suspect many of you might be familiar with this model, but the reconceptualized model of multiple dimensions of identity, that's a mouthful. So from Lisa Abis and Susan Jones and colleagues. And so this really, in a nutshell, some of what was valuable to us about this model, down in the lower left of the visual, you think about all of these contextual influences that all of us take in and that our participants take in: peers, family, norms, stereotypes. And then those get filtered. So we make meaning of those through, in this model, they call it a meaning-making filter. That might be more porous, meaning that a lot of those contextual influences, sort of pass through without a lot of necessarily introspection or interrogation. or it might be a little more closed. So it might be, I think they even use the word sort of a sophisticated meaning-making filter. They have 3 levels that they present in this model. A more foundational meaning-making filter is a term that they use. And so all of that ultimately also affects how we perceive our multiple identities, both our personal identities and social identities. And in the visual here, there are various sort of nodes or dots surrounding a core sort of personal attributes and identities. And you can imagine each of those dots or nodes as sort of a different social identity. So it could be race, it could be sexuality, gender identity, disability, whatever it might be, that might be closer to or further from the core, depending on how salient or important that identity is. So we thought this would be a useful tool to sort of help us, in addition to using inductive processes, but help us to frame some of our work. We used the 2007 version of this model. There have been some updates since then. In particular, and for some of the 2013 updates, that helps us in our analysis because it does bring in the roles of systems of oppression, like racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia. So that's something that we do acknowledge in this work, and that our participants also talked about the influences of that on their lives. So what you see here on the screen, this table is a brief snapshot, and this is in the article, of course, as well, but a brief snapshot of the 8 participants that we had in the study. A few things that I would note about this: all but one participant listed here identifies with multiple disabilities, in addition to either autism or Asperger's. And that's something we saw across the entire study. So the experience of multiple disabilities. Also, in terms of gender identity and sexuality, most participants using multiple terms, and perhaps using terms differently according to context. So they might use one term with peers at college, and maybe a different term if they are out to family, as one example. Our sample is majority white. 3 of the 8 participants identified as people of color in this particular study. So what I want to move into now briefly, I'm not going to, just for the sake of time and that you have access to the article, I won't comment on all of the 8 participants, but I think I've got 3 or 4 that I wanted to make a point or two about. And so we presented in line with a narrative inquiry approach, wanting to capture more of stories rather than artificially sort of segmenting those. We chose to construct some vignettes of participants. And so that included some summary data, some interpretive data from us as researchers, and then also some direct quotes from participants. And so I'll make a few comments from a few of the participants that are of note. So Antonio was one participant. Many participants talked about whether they felt that there was some link or some connection between being autistic and identifying as part of the LGBTQ community. And so Antonio, for instance, talked about having Asperger's, and that in relationship to what he termed incomplete gender socialization, that he really viewed a connection there. He also, and several other participants did as well, talked about the importance of online and web-based platforms for learning about, in this case, Antonio learning about himself and exploring his identities. And so he referenced specifically the Wrong Planet website. Antonio participated in an autistic support program at his university. And so that was offered at one of the 2 universities, so not both of them, but he was at the one that had that program, and he participated. But he talked about that when he shared about his boyfriend, that he encountered discomfort from other members of the autistic support program. And so that was something that alienated him a bit from that program. So I'll also highlight the experiences of Avery. And so Avery identified as autistic and asexual. And again, she described really viewing a tight connection between those identities. She thought that they sort of complemented each other. She was also someone, in addition to herself identifying as autistic, and she had disclosed that she had Asperger's, but that she thought it was important to identify as autistic in terms of solidarity and looking at that, as a whole. She described participating in a lot of online communities relating to autism. She was also, her academic research and her career was also focused on autism research. So she was very, very committed, both personally and professionally. She described, we talked to students about how they engaged with disability communities or with queer and trans communities. And Avery described some difficulties accessing queer communities, that she felt like these were often spaces that were highly social, that were overwhelming, that were loud, that were often inaccessible. She also had some health problems and some mobility issues that prevented her from fully participating. And so she described really more of a connection, or feeling more of a place, more at home within disability communities, rather than some of the mainstream LGBTQ communities. So Blair, in some ways, and I'll pick up on that note of community, had kind of the opposite experience, in that he did not desire to really be necessarily identified outwardly as autistic or to participate in communities related to autism or disability. He used the term, he said he'd rather be part of the, quote, general population. He did find it important to participate in LGBTQ organizations, but similarly to Avery, he talked about being really introverted, and that he felt like that was sometimes at odds with what it meant to participate in an LGBT community. And so he talked about LGBT student groups on campus and the LGBT center on campus. He felt like there was really a pressure to be social and to be outgoing that was in conflict with who he was as a person with Asperger's. He also, a lot of our participants talked about disclosure and passing sometimes, either intentionally or unintentionally. And Blair was one participant who talked about really intentionally trying to pass as neurotypical, and doing things like altering some of his traits and thinking about how he conversed with others to have sort of what he called balanced conversations. So he was really navigating a lot of those issues of passing and disclosure really intentionally. And I also want to highlight, I think this will be the last example I'll highlight, Hugo. And so Hugo was really contending with quite a few intersecting forms of oppression and marginalization on campus. So he was facing transphobia and homophobia, facing racism, facing ableism, and really channeled, was frustrated a lot at times by that, had a deep impact, but he also channeled a lot of that energy into being an activist and being an advocate. And he was involved in a queer people of color organization on the campus, heavily involved in cultural centers at the university as well. And so he, like some of the other participants I've highlighted, viewed some connections, yet also some tension between autism and demisexuality. And so he framed demisexuality as really needing an emotional connection to be present before engaging romantically or sexually with a partner. And so he described sort of that, again, that idea of how close do you want to get to someone, that he felt like the autism and demisexuality sort of complemented each other in that way. He also felt like it gave him more of a platform and more of he could be a voice. He could listen to others who were marginalized. And again, I mentioned, really became an activist around that. But again, and I think I won't read the quote that's highlighted there, but he really felt the weight and the strain of multiple forms of oppression, that really came out in speaking with Hugo. So those are just 4 of the 8. So I hope that you have a chance maybe to engage with the article and take a look at some of the other information there. Some of the common threads that Brett and I saw as we looked through. So one that really came shining through, this notion of complex identity management and visibility. It was not as simple as, being out or not being out or being in the closet. Participants described navigating sort of issues of passing and disclosure. And we really wanted to approach this, again, from an asset-based lens and not from a deficit-based lens. So there's been some critique of notions of not disclosing particular identities or of passing for more privileged identities. But we found that participants really made some intentional decisions that they wanted to avoid stigma, that every new environment they were in, be it a class, an organization, friends, family, whatever it might be, really evaluating each situation and context on its own to make decisions about how much a participant wanted to disclose or wanted to sort of embody and share about their identity. And so that does acknowledge, participants named and took into account in many cases systems of oppression, that they were drawing on personal resources, wanting to maintain relationships. So we try to reframe, disclosure or sort of non-disclosure in some cases, that can be an asset, that can be a tool that students deploy strategically. We also note, and you probably heard it come through in some of the examples I shared, the notion of social anxiety. And that heavily influenced how students were involved on campus, how they were involved in various communities. So many, if not all of the participants did want to be involved either in various spaces related to the LGBT community or in autism or disability related communities, but they found challenges in doing so due to difficulties with social engagement, social anxiety. And so this really points to the need for more affirming spaces. Again, as the examples pointed out, an autistic space or a disability space may not necessarily be inclusive of gender and sexuality, and vice versa, right? The LGBT community may not be as inclusive of differing abilities. And so for many students, the notion of going online, which has become, it was already important, but has become even more important in the last several months, online spaces and virtual spaces and phone apps and various communities online became very important lifelines and resources for students. And several students talked about that, these were some of the only spaces that they felt like they could acknowledge and be fully open and transparent about their multiple identities. I'll also mention just briefly in terms of the model that we had presented. So we looked at the role of contextual influences, and there were 3 sort of meaning-making filters in this model. We didn't find anyone having what Jones and colleagues called a formulaic meaning-making filter. Everyone was sort of in the transitional or foundational place. But we pushed back against this model a little bit because in the model, there is a link between sort of how complex is your meaning making internally with how you disclose your identities to others. And we want to sort of suggest that it's more complicated than that just because you don't necessarily disclose an identity consistently doesn't mean your meaning making about that decision is not complex. We also disagree with the notion that, if you're sort of at the foundational level, which in this case is sort of the more sophisticated meaning making level, we don't think you necessarily need to present your identity in a consistent manner regardless of the environment. Again, you can make strategic choices that make sense for you. We also point out that this model was developed with, though it was developed with some LGBT students in mind, it was still developed with a neurotypical lens. And so we think that some of these contributions that we're suggesting can help expand this model a little bit. Just briefly, and I'm going to be conscious of time because I know we want to get to questions and discussion, but we do share in the article some implications for practice. So thinking of campus spaces, and I would say again, it was important before the pandemic. It's even more important now to also think of online spaces as part of our campus. I think sometimes practitioners in higher education have sort of washed our hands of how students engage online and not thought about that fully. And so I think that we need to think about both physical spaces and online spaces and how they can be embracing of intersectional and multiple identities. And so certainly disability centers, disability resource centers, as well as LGBT centers come to mind. But we also argue this is a responsibility of all campus offices, of all academic departments to really think about how they might do this. How faculty and staff might seek and receive appropriate training and education on these identities as well. Being familiar with resources that are on campus or in some cases in the community if the campus doesn't have appropriate resources, and being able to make really culturally and identity conscious and competent referrals and collaborate with other folks on campus. We think that this study also presents some implications for really an argument for really having participants very involved in research. Although this study was not framed as participatory action research, we think that this line of research could lend itself to that well. I didn't mention earlier, but in setting up interviews with students, we gave maximum flexibility of when did they want to meet, where did they want to meet. Would you rather have one longer interview or maybe a few shorter interviews, that kind of thing. So we tried to be as flexible as possible there. And again, really highlight the asset-based lens and strengths-based approach as well. But as we transition into some questions and discussion, so you had the link to the article that I've been talking about that's been shared in the agenda and in the chat. I also wanted to mention and congratulate Brett, who is the first author, and I was a collaborator on a case study that I've got a screenshot on their left there and then a link to. That these came out around the same time, and in some ways I think this could function almost as a companion to the research article. So this is a case in the Journal of Cases in Educational Leadership, and so we've designed it to be really hopefully accessible. And so if this is something that you'd like to use in a training with staff or in a class or whatever your context might be, we hope that that you find this case and some of the discussion questions that we presented could be a nice sort of valuable companion to this research. So I think I'm usually over time, so I hope I'm doing okay there, but I will stop there and we can have some questions and discussion.
All right, thanks very much, Ryan. I know a few questions are starting to emerge in the chat, but we also want to also be mindful of if folks want to verbally share questions that they have. We'll have about 10 minutes or so toward this end. First question that I see in the chat is from Siva. Did any participants talk about identity or perceptions from coworkers in the workplace? Is it any different or similar to experiences in college?
Yeah, let me go back to the correct window. Trying to think, and also Brett, please jump in as you like and as you remember things. I do remember one participant in particular talking about, I believe she had a retail job that was off campus and not feeling, not feeling comfortable disclosing, I think both autistic identity, but also she was trans and not wanting to disclose that for fear of stigma and retribution. I'm trying to think of others who specifically talked about workplaces. We did focus largely on the college environment, so I think that was where most of those perceptions come out. But Brett, does anything else come to mind for you?
No, that's the one I would have mentioned. So I think that's, yeah. I think too, what we saw a lot of is how students talked about their identities on campus versus at home too, in terms of their relationships with family members as well. Next question comes from John, is when you say groups were siloed, in air quotes, or quotes, was the siloing equal between the LGBTQ and autism groups, or was there less willingness to be inclusive from one side or the other?
Yeah, I think we use that term siloed to mean at least two different things. In one sense, so first of all, in terms of framing the study and the research, we talked about, in looking again at published research, that there was sort of a silo effect, that these groups were not presented as overlapping, right, and as intersectional. So there was sort of separate research. So that was one purpose. But then it also came out in the findings in terms of what participants shared. And I think that more, and I think we talk about this a little bit in the article, that more of the participants were interested in being involved in LGBT communities than with autism groups or communities. But I think for those who were involved, there were some, as some of the examples pointed to, I think there were examples of really both, of either seeing that a disability group was not as inclusive, or that an LGBT group was not as inclusive of the other side. So participants didn't necessarily desire those spaces in the same way or to the same degree from what we read from our participants. But I think there were difficulties in both. I think, if anything, maybe there were some signs that LGBT spaces were more difficult to access. And I think, again, with notions of what is the LGBT community, what are LGBTQ spaces, and that there was difficulty with, again, this expectation of extroversion and really being outgoing and really engaging socially. very highly. I think that came through. So I think if anything, maybe it did lean towards some of the LGBT spaces being more difficult to access. Brett, I don't know if you had that impression as well.
Yeah, I would probably be inclined to feel to have interpreted it similarly. And I think too, one thing that's worth acknowledging, and we talk a little bit about it in the article, when students were diagnosed with autism and to what degree they were out and comfortable about their gender and sexual identities also had repercussions in terms of both positively and negatively in terms of how they engaged with spaces. So that's a factor just based on students' own development. Kristen has a question. What were some specific strategies the students recommend for making spaces more inclusive?
Yeah, so this was a great question, and this was something that was toward the interview protocol that we did want to get students' takes on what they thought would help. I think that I think maybe the most commonly mentioned one across the board was feeling like they needed faculty and staff to have more education, more training, more sensitivity, more awareness, more knowledge, more skills. I could go on, but that really this idea of faculty and staff needing to, and also educate themselves, right? To not rely on students to do that education, to provide that for them. So I think, in students' names specifically, they talked about in relation to LGBTQ communities, they talked about, safe space and safe zone trainings, but they felt that was also really important around ability and disability, and that, we have seen more campuses move in that direction of providing those intentional trainings and workshops. At one of the campuses, there was already and this was conducted several years ago, but there was a disability, I'm going to forget the name, but sort of a disability ally or a disability safe zone type training. So students thought training was important, but also training not just on disability over here and LGBT identities over here, but really doing some work around intersectionality and multiple identities. So that was named a lot. I think too, just briefly, a lot of participants talked about the need for visual sort of indicators, that you couldn't assume that any particular faculty or staff member was a safe person to disclose to or to talk to. So the need for, if it was that safe space or safe zone ally placard or something like that, or a statement in a syllabus was something that a lot of folks mentioned about diversity and equity and naming particular identities, or something, if you have visual cues in your office, when you have students for office hours or whatever it might be. So I think those visual cues were also important for students as well.
Very good. Yeah, agreed. Siva has a follow-up question to Kristen's. What had participants done to change perceptions or educate peers/professors?
Yeah, I think that this was, I'll say first of all that I think not all participants felt the need or felt compelled to educate, peers or professors or staff members. So I think not everyone was interested or maybe even viewed themselves in a place where they thought they could take that on. However, there were several participants, including some of the ones that I highlighted briefly today, who definitely talked about the need that they felt like they had to help change the campus, that they had to help make it more inclusive. And so a lot of students did that through on-campus involvement in a student organization. And so whether that be, it was students more often participated in LGBT organizations than autistic or disability related organizations, but that was one outlet to have public programming and speakers and social events and that sort of thing. Some participants did mention working on campus, like Hugo was working for the Multicultural Center on campus and doing a lot of education work through that role. I'm trying to think. And then, as I mentioned, after the study took place, that I would extend invitations to some of the participants, all of the participants from the research, that, did they want to be on panels? Did they want to, take an educating role there? And several folks took me up on that offer, and we had some really, really important, really meaningful events around that as well.
Okay, we have time for one more question from John. This will probably need to be addressed more concisely in the interest of time. Was there any education on the overlap between LGBTQ and autism. From the research I have come across, people with autism are more likely to identify as LGBTQ than are neurotypical people. Many students I have come across do not know that on both the LGBTQ and autism sides.
Yeah, so this is, and we, in the article, we cite some of the studies that I think you're alluding to about that connection and about that there might be a higher, sort of overlap in the population. So that's something we do highlight there. That was also information that some of the student participants were aware of and that they talked about in interviews, that they knew that there was a higher proportion or that they suspected there was. And again, that they drew some links between that themselves. So I think some of the participants were aware of it. However, the way participants framed it to us is that there was such a lack of awareness about those connections, about those intersections on campus, that students did not find spaces generally that were intersectional in nature, did not find spaces that would acknowledge that. And they were really thirsty for that, really, really wanting that. And some of the participants, as we shared transcripts and emerging findings, a common comment that I heard was that it was validating, that producing this research and taking part of it showed them that they were not the only one. Some of the participants really did think that, is there anyone else out there like me? So this was something, again, now this was conducted several years ago, and some of the research in this area has grown, but it was certainly something that, that was meaningful and important to participants in validating that they were able to participate.
Absolutely. Well, at this point, we're going to be wrapping up. Thank you again, Ryan, for joining everybody. This was very rewarding on a personal front, and I think the greater implications of this work is the notion of that there's more stories to be told about how students who are part of the autism community experience many different identities, some apparent, some non-apparent as well. So we're excited about future scholarship on this front, and also so many of you who work directly with these students and know about this from your firsthand experience to continue to disseminate that knowledge and figure out resources that might be useful. So at this time, we're going to be wrapping up. So I want to remind folks to, again, remain connected to the Canvas listserv. Definitely check out Ryan's article. We'll be having, as I said, all the articles and resources that were shared in the chat and other spaces. We'll catalog that for the minutes. We'll have, hopefully, the video recording for this seems to have worked out okay. So please feel free to access that at a later point. Per usual with Canvas, we are taking a June break. So we encourage everybody to hopefully take some time to have a very restorative June. We'll join you here again in July. We're assembling a really great schedule for July and thereafter. Many folks in our Canvas community are going to be presenters talking about their work, and inviting some folks as well who, or other folks who haven't been as directly connected, but who are excited to share their respective work. So we have a lot on the horizon. We'll be providing you with some of those meeting details in the next few weeks. So stay tuned to the Canvas listserv toward that end. And yes, we are very glad you could join us today, and we wish you a very good rest of your week ahead. Thanks.
Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Brett.